It's worth pointing out just a couple of things that you should keep in mind when we think of this film, Birth of a Nation. Now, Birth of a Nation was also subtitled, or at least previously been named, The Klansman. And of course, the book by Thomas Dixon, the minister that I mentioned, the novel, which was published in about 1905, was called The Klansman. And so Birth of a Nation is based on it, and Birth of a Nation was initially called The Klansman. The film appeared in 1915. And as I mentioned, it was viewed and in Woodrow Wilson's in the White House with the cabinet and so on and so forth, and it had a massive following, and it was greatly successful. But it's interesting if we think about it because it was called The Klansman. And one of the things that I will talk about a little later is the impact of the film. The Klansman is referring to the Ku Klux Klan very specifically. And in many ways, one could call the film a justification, an apology, a rationalization. And not only that, but a celebration of the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan. The film actually depicts the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan and presents the story about how the Ku Klux Klan becomes formed, and therefore it becomes celebrated. In fact, one of the great impacts of the film Birth of a Nation was the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, to the point where the Ku Klux Klan becomes a dominant force in American society well into the 20th century, right up into the 60s and 70s. And the film was at the heart of it by creating this narrative of how that organization came to rescue America during the Reconstruction period. And I think it's worth paying attention to that construction and that narrative. The argument was that the Klan was a militia that was formed as a result of the marauding and loose behavior of African Americans who knew how it started to gain power in government and in other positions. And it was an attempt to say that after the Civil War, white people became the victims of black advancement and black success, and the Klan itself became a way to rescue white society from blacks, but also to rescue white society from the corrupt, as far as he was concerned, the corruption of the federal government that was occupying the South at the time. If we think about it in those terms, and of course we think about it, that this was the elevation of the Klansman, we begin to understand it. You'll see in the film, it's kind of almost ludicrous when you think about it. But the garb that the Klan wore, the hoods and all that kind of thing, they create a myth that says that it was done because they watched some white kids scare some black kids who are just always scared by anything, and so they decided to wear it because they figured that this would be something that would scare black people. Um, there's something quite haunting and disturbing about it. And one of the interesting things in my own sort of work and experience in interviewing people who lived in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, particularly in South Carolina, where I lived and worked for many years, um, were the stories about how the Klan would enter villages and communities, burn flags, and threaten and actually lynch people. That was the same Klan that W.C. Griffiths was celebrating, was honoring, was treating as valid and so on, and that Woodrow Wilson would declare to be noble in endorsing the film's narrative and this film's teaching. So one of the things I think is worth paying attention to in the film would be, first of all, to look at the ways in which the American narrative and the American Civil War is seen as the fight between two brothers, between a family. And they're two related families across the borders, and they come to war with each other. And they come to war with each other around this idea of slavery. So that's the first thing to pay attention to. The second thing is the portrayal of the African American and the position of the African American. As you'll see from the beginning of the film, African Americans are portrayed in that film as either being unintelligent, naive, and in many instances, happy slaves, essentially. And the happiness of slaves seemed to be the theme of the film, to suggest that all the propaganda that had been going on that would lead to people thinking there needs to be a civil war was false, that it had no basis on reality. The slaves would sing and dance and shuck and so on and so forth all the way through. It also portrayed many of the slaves as loyal to their white masters and their white owners. Again, a demonstration that this was normal and this was okay. The third thing that you should see is the nobility of the white planter class, as is demonstrated in this film. Their nobility, their kindness, their generosity, their humanity. They fall in love. They have relationships. They have a dynamic human experience. They feel sorrow. They, on the death of one of their relatives in war, they're wounded and they're hurt. They're kind to the black people who work for them and so on. All of these narratives were constructing an idea about American society that ran counter to the actual historical account. But it was being presented in film, and it had a powerful impact on constructing this claim that the Civil War was an aberration. The fourth thing to pay attention to is the movement towards the assassination of Lincoln, because that takes place now. Now it's interesting because the film's treatment of Lincoln is fascinating. The filmmakers could not denigrate Lincoln as an evil person, but they saw Lincoln as somebody who had been misguided by people like the African Americans who seemed to find their way closer to the American government at the time. And therefore, this is the way in which we see portrayals of people like Frederick Douglass and mostly mulatto and mixed race people portrayed in that film. So when we get to the sections that are about the White House and that are about Washington, the corruption is especially located in mixed race people. And therefore, the view is that Lincoln was misguided by these lies and so on. And therefore, while there's the lamentation for the assassination of Lincoln, there's also a sense in which it was justified, and the film seems to portray that notion. So the film then covers the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, and the period of Reconstruction, which is the heart of the film. The heart of the film is to say that during Reconstruction, when the American army occupied the South, led by people like Sherman, who the film views as brutal and bloody, as one of the Union forces, the need for the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan to restore the dignity, the nobility, the wonderful myth of regal understanding of self. That is the southern civility, the southern civilization was needed, and at the core of that movement towards that, it had to be driven by, at least in his accounting, by the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan. And so what we'll see in the film is, as you get to the second part of the film, you'll see the way that the Ku Klux Klan operated. The Ku Klux Klan were vigilantes. In the film, they were vigilantes. They were vigilantes that fought a skirmishing war against, a guerrilla war against the Union forces, but then would become the protectors of white society, and particularly white women, because then the film presents black people as dangerous and black men as especially interested in raping and attacking white women. And this is how the film portrays the African American. One of the most telling things about the film, of course, is the ways in which the African American is portrayed, indeed. And it is one of those films in which blackface became the way in which, in many instances, the African Americans were portrayed. It was white actors wearing blackface as black people. And of course, it's not convincing. You'll see right away that it is not convincing. But it was also an indication of the racism in the very industry of film. But it also demonized the black person because, of course, these portrayals were exaggerations. They were attempting to show that black people were inhuman, they were animalistic, and that they had no capacity for good things. The film oscillated, of course, because some of the footage from the early part of the film, where they're on the plantation and so on and so forth, is actual footage of southern black communities and so on. So we see some actual African Americans in the film, but they're not leading roles, and they do not have spoken roles at all. The film, as I said, was massively successful. However, it was also, before the film was even released, the NAACP and many black organizations protested the film. And in fact, it led to many marches all over the East Coast and all over the the middle of America, massive, massive demonstrations against the film. There were lawsuits set out against the film. There was a lot of writing against the film and its abhorrence and its ugliness and its portrayal of black people and its celebration of violence against black people and lynching. And this was not this is massively significant. There was a lot of writing and protest writing and critique of the film during the time of its release. So when Wilson, for instance, decides to view the film, it's the first film that was going to be viewed in the White House, and to chose to then announce it as an articulation of truth, he wasn't doing it in ignorance. It's not as if he didn't know that this was a film that African Americans protested against and boycotted and were not in support of. He absolutely knew that, but despite that, he felt that he should still he would endorse the film and he would deem the film as correct. It is, in a sense, the beginning of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. This film celebrated the Klan, and Klan societies began to emerge across the United States of America. And they emerged in almost every state, including here in Nebraska, where the Ku Klux Klan had established itself in places like Kansas City, and then, of course, further here into Nebraska. There was a long-standing Ku Klux Klan organization here, and has been from that day on. The Klan would become a critical voice and a critical force of violence and intimidation against those people who were arguing against segregation, against the disenfranchisement of racism and Jim Crow laws. And the film can be said to have been a great precipitator of that emergence in America. So why watch the film? I think it's worth looking at the film to see a contemporary, meaning contemporary to that time, a contemporary way in which people were presenting the history of America and the history of slavery and the history of the movement out of slavery at the time, and it's worth sort of seeing that. Sometimes you might stumble because the filming does seem a little early days, right? So some things are there, but you begin to see how brilliantly the narrative is constructed and how the film is using different techniques that will become hugely important and almost standard in filmmaking today. So it's worth looking at that. But it's also worth understanding that when W.B. Du Bois in 1902 declares that the race issue will be the central issue of the 20th century, this film begins to demonstrate why, in fact, his prophecy and his statement was absolutely accurate and was absolutely true. When you think about writing a commentary on this, I would like you to talk about some of these themes that are emerging in the film, that you see emerging in the film, and some of the ways in which the film handles them and operates on them and articulates them. I want you to respond as viscerally and just by yourself as possible, and just pay attention to how you see the film unfolding. So thank you very much.